Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria University, please go to avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am very honored to be able to have on the show Dr. Robert Redfield, the 18th director of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, known as the CDC, which you held, I think, as a position from 2018 to 2021, appointed by President Trump and as our 45th president. So welcome to the show, Dr. Redfield.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So glad to have you on the show. And you're visiting Ave Maria to give the Paula Castagnet annual lectures on science and faith. And so we're so glad to have you. You gave a lecture yesterday. You'll be giving a lecture later today on both your journey as a Catholic scientist and medical doctor, as well as, I think, lessons you've learned from responding to the COVID outbreak.
That's right. I'm looking forward to it.
That's great. So, I was able to hear your talk a little bit, and I was really moved by your journey from kind of a scientific worldview that was somewhat maybe, more atheistic or more seeing God as a cosmic energy force to this discovery of God as a person, and a God who's not only a person, but has a personal interest in you. And I love the way that you told the story about, John Paul II and the pivotal role that your encounter with him played in that. But I'd love if you, tell our listeners just a little bit about your story of faith and your story of coming to kind of have a deeper, Catholic life with faith in Jesus Christ.
Thank you. Well, I came from a science family. My mom and dad were both scientists. And my mother was really a devout Catholic, and her mother was sort of the matriarch of keeping the faith in our family for years. But I evolved as I went through my development, really come to think of God. I went to my first theology course at Georgetown, where I went to college, and my theology teacher there was a Protestant theologian who basically told us that we were kind of living in la-la land, believing in what our parents had taught us about God, that God actually was an energy force. And that if we brought good energy in the world, then that was a good thing. And if we brought bad energy in the world, that wasn't a good thing. So by the time I got into second year theology at Georgetown, I now had a very scientific view of God, and no longer did I embrace this personal concept. Fast forward, I was involved in trying to take care and treat and research the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. And as part of all that, I spent a lot of time trying to activate the Catholic Church to get more involved in the AIDS epidemic, more in an effective way, particularly in care and treatment for the sick and dying, and to, embrace science to try to solve this issue. And Pope John Paul finally decided in 1989 to have a conference in Rome on AIDS. It was called To Live Why. And I was one of the 20 scientists, clinical researchers that were invited to meet with about 100 theologians. And we spent about 3 to 5 days discussing the AIDS epidemic, largely from the Church's perspective. I got to give a talk. The Holy Father gave a talk. It was very special. And at the end of it, it was a kind of interesting. The time I was in Rome, from the time I got there to the time I spoke and to the time I met the Holy Father, I spent a lot of time. I didn't eat, so I was fasting, even though I wasn't intentionally fasting, but it turned out I was fasting. And I spent time at St. Peter's uh, trying to pray. I had my grandmother's rosary, and I had a little pamphlet on how to say the rosary because I totally didn't know how to do it anymore. And, I was very reflective, and I gave my paper, Pope gave his paper, and at the end of it, I got tapped by one of the cardinals there to go meet the Holy Father. And when I finished meeting the Pope, my colleagues, who were very prominent scientists from all around the world, sort of jumped on me and said, "What did I tell him? Did you tell him this? Did you tell him this? Did you tell him the church to do this? Did you tell the church to do that?" And most of them really weren't Catholic, but they were very aggressive in what the Pope needed to hear. And I really felt kind of bad afterwards because I was the one picked for the meeting. And I said, I didn't tell him anything.
Wow.
And they, and my wife will tell you that's unusual because I usually have a lot to say. And so I said I listened to what he had to tell me. And so what the Pope taught me, and some of it was from what he said, and a lot of it was the Holy Spirit. It was a very special. I'll tell you, this whole experience with the Pope, I describe in my life as a Paulinian conversion. I didn't get knocked off a horse, and I didn't go blind, but I was a totally different person the next day. I mean, totally different person. The first thing the Pope related to me was that I was incorrect in my view of the world that God was an energy force. And then I needed to reestablish a personal relationship with God. God as a person that was within you, and really develop that personal relationship. And the second thing he told me is I was incorrect in what I had come to believe is that prayer was an illusion, because we were taught in Freud's book, Future of an Illusion, in medical school, that prayer was kind of just a crutch, an illusion. Pope said that prayer was the most powerful tool I had, and I needed to learn how to use it and use it frequently. Now, I will tell you, both of those things I instantaneously knew to be true. Instantaneously. And I'm not one that would do that. I mean, I knew now this is true. It's a person. Prayer's powerful. And then the third thing the Pope told me was that there's redemptive value in human suffering. And I didn't instantaneously believe. I told him, no, I don't buy it. I'm a doctor. I don't see any value in my patient's suffering whatsoever. He suggested that I read his encyclical on human suffering, the redemptive value of human suffering, which I subsequently did weeks and later after I left Rome. But we kind of left it at that. And as I say, I felt a little disappointed in myself because my colleagues were all over me that I didn't tell them anything. And I have to admit, I didn't quite understand everything I had learned from my interaction with the Pope until the next morning when I took a shower. And I do believe it was like a baptismal shower. It was like a new beginning. I looked in the mirror, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw God within me, and it was really freaky. And I was a different person from that day on. When I got home from Rome the next day, my wife wasn't quite sure who walked in the door, and I started going to daily mass. And it was really, when I say it was a Paulinian conversion, it was a Paulinian conversion. And it was very, very special. And, I've treasured it all my life while I was given that gift. When it came to the redemptive value of human suffering, though, I didn't buy it. And then about a year and a half later, I got a phone call from the Vatican asking me if I would like to join the Pope and the Vatican delegation for the first World Day for the Sick to Lourdes on February 11th, 1992. And I obviously said I would like to do that. And I flew to the Vatican and stayed at the North American Seminary. And and then went on the Vatican plane to be part of the Vatican delegation to celebrate the first World Day for the Sick. And on that plane, there was 3 Americans. The other 2 were both priests. I was the only non-ordained person on the plane, so why do I get this trip? And what I experienced over the next week in Lourdes was I witnessed up close and personal the redemptive value of human suffering. There were 25,000 people coming in, looking for miraculous cures. I initially was not a happy camper because I saw all these people really expecting, cures, and I didn't think they were going to get it. I did sit in on several miracle investigations, which were very, very interesting. But the biggest miracle that I saw in thousands of people was the total acceptance of their illness, or the fact that their wife had a stroke, or their child had an anesthesia accident, and they had a sense of great peace that came with them now of acceptance, because they knew they were in this not alone, that God was with them through this journey, and there was redemptive value in whatever suffering they were experienced, and don't throw it away, use it. And then when I got back to my practice, and my practice at the time was largely focused on taking care of men and women that were dying of AIDS, many of which had a lot of suffering. It was very complicated. I then brought that to my practice to try to educate them that through their suffering they had enormous power, and they should, learn to use it and use it wisely. So it was a life-changing experience. It changed my life forever. It changed the way I practice medicine. Pope John Paul was an enormously special individual. I've always felt very close to him, even before they canonized him. And I always wonder, kind of, you can argue, why me? Why did God pick me out to be the only non-clergy person on a plane? It is interesting. At the time, I didn't totally appreciate the tension in our world today with spiritual warfare, which I've come to understand right up front and personal. But that exact same day that the Holy Father celebrated the lives of the sick and illness and the redemptive value of human suffering is the exact same day that the Netherlands legalized euthanasia. So you have to wonder, here the Pope is trying to celebrate suffering and illness and see it as something that could bring redemptive value to the world. And there you had the Netherlands say, hey, if you're suffering too much, don't worry about it. You can have assisted suicide or take your own life. It's fine.
Yeah, that is really chilling to see that. And it is, it's one of our doctoral students is from Uganda. Mm-hmm. He completed his doctoral program with us, and his bishop sent him to the United States partly to study the Pope John Paul II's theology of the body, but as it applied to suffering. Mm-hmm. And he ended up writing his dissertation, Father Joseph Lugalambi. We have an episode on the Catholic Theology Show about really the theology of the body and suffering. And his idea was that if we're going to go back into Uganda, and so many people are suffering, where the AIDS epidemic is still kind of like at work. It's in the, it's in the blood systems in some ways, as far as I understand it. But that the people are suffering, and that they need to really become aware that just as God redeemed us through his body on the cross, so our bodies have meaning and purpose.
Yeah, I will say that in my practice of medicine, and I've cared for thousands of men and women with HIV infection, originally most of which died. Mm-hmm. And they died tough deaths, usually in their 20s and early 30s, maybe between 20 and 40. I will tell you, of all those patients I cared for, I don't have a single one that was angry about having AIDS. All of them over time, and maybe it was part of our relationship, and maybe it was somehow fostered partially by my trying to help them see the redemptive value of the suffering that they're going through. All of them thank God for that experience. and I will say that the AIDS infection brought them closer to God, which they found at the end of the day more important than, a healthy body. Very interesting. And I was always taken back by it, how I saw the faith. And I gave a lot of talks and lectures about AIDS in the early years, and many people misunderstood me. And I would say publicly that the men and women that I have around me with HIV infection and throughout the world, I view them as the modern day saints. And their job is to get the rest of us back on track, because we've been distracted by the pursuit of money or power or fame. And here you see these people in the prime of their lives, 22 years old, going from 180 pounds to 100 pounds, and you see them, lose their ability to live. If that doesn't wake you up, and particularly then when you see they go through this and they're not angry and they're not bitter and they're, in a way, thankful to God, for awakening them, you really have to wonder. And I do still believe that in my own view of the world, is the men and women that were suffering with AIDS really are modern day saints that were sent here to help get the rest of us back on track.
There's a line from a book called Darby and Joan by Maurice Baring, who was a kind of a fellow early 20th century convert to Catholicism, somewhat a friend of G.K. Chesterton or in that time period. But in his book, Darby and Joan, he writes at one time where he says that a priest told him, the main character, Darby, that the secret to life is accepted suffering. And that basically if we can learn to accept suffering, we've kind of learned everything we need to know in this world. So maybe, again, as a doctor who worked, and as when you first heard this idea of accepting suffering or the redemptive power of suffering, you scoffed at it. Could you walk us through a little bit more? What would you say to people who struggle with that idea, maybe struggle with their own suffering or with the suffering of others, and might be tempted to feel as though the Dutch euthanasia law, and so many other countries have euthanasia laws now, is a more merciful way of dealing with, death and dying?
Yeah, and I think it's a hard question. I mean, I have a picture that I bought in Lourdes during that trip, a painting, and it's a painting of the Holy Father, St. John Paul II, and his arms are raised, and he's praying, and the clouds are opening, and it's if the energy of his prayers are going to God. And then around his feet are people that are clearly famined and diseased and dying. And it was sort of a reaffirmation for me that through all that suffering, the Pope, it was channeling through the Pope to God, for redemptive value for our world. And I've kept that painting in my office at home just to remind me of that whole experience, and the importance. And I actually wrote a letter to John Paul afterwards, telling him I'd keep him in my prayers, and I understood, the burden that he had to have to be the vehicle of channeling all that suffering for its redemptive value. Cardinal O'Connor used to tell me, we cared for AIDS patients together in New York, sometimes on weekends, and he used to tell me, through the suffering of this man, some young girl in Australia is not going to commit suicide. And I'd tell the Cardinal he was batty. Okay, there's no way that this man's suffering had any impact on whether some girl in Australia commits suicide. Well, I don't agree with what I used to think. I think there is a supernatural, spiritual harmony that can come from embracing. So I try to let people begin to at least talk about their suffering. And most of my patients really did come to understand that their suffering actually had value. And if you can get to that point, as you pointed out, I think you really have gotten it. If you can accept your suffering, realize and have a value, and then decide where you want to channel its reward, and most of them don't want to channel the reward to themselves. they want to channel the award to, somebody else they know or somebody they don't know in terms of improving the human condition. So, but it's not a normal response. Many people that look at life from a very secular lens would see that as not making any sense at all. But I've come to learn firsthand, and it did take, how many people get an opportunity to be invited to be on the Vatican delegation to the First World Day for the Sick and spend 5 days with the Vatican delegation to sort of whack it through your head. I must have been a very slow study for God to decide, I need you to come here and get this done. I will say it affected my practice of medicine enormously, and then I think affected the lives, and the suffering of many people. And I keep on my desk at home the encyclical by the Holy Father about the redemptive value of human suffering, just to remind me that there is. And of course, God taught us that. Our Lord's suffering had enormous redemptive value, but it's not just isolated to his suffering. It can be experienced, embraced, amplified by all of our suffering if we learn to accept it. Not an easy thing to do. None of us get up in the morning and say, please let me suffer. But I think when you finally realize suffering is part of life, and it can have enormous value. We're taught, as you know, you hear it all the time, just carry your cross. Well, human suffering is a cross to carry, and if you can do it in synergistic harmony with God, realizing that he's on your team, this is not a punishment. The truth is, it may be a gift.
I remember reading in a book once on kind of why suffering or something along those lines. It was on a retreat, and I remember picking it up, and all I remember is the first page of it or something, but it basically said, the author, who I think was a woman, said something like, well, if you're going through suffering, would you rather talk to somebody who has gone through suffering or somebody who has never suffered? And, basic idea is that, well, I'd rather talk to somebody who understands the suffering that I've gone through. And so she was kind of like, well, whatever else we know about suffering is it somehow makes us more compassionate, more understanding, almost in a way for us to recognize how much God is compassionate towards us.
Yeah,
he, in his human nature, goes through suffering.
I would say if you really get into it fully and correctly, what it really does is it brings you close to oneness with Christ. Many people I don't think can really comprehend the degree of suffering that Christ allowed himself to go through. And in that case, he allowed himself to go through it, because he could have said, time out, enough's enough, I'm moving on. So I find it there in a way, it's an opportunity to bond really with Christ, and really get a better appreciation for the decisions that he made for us, to give us a lesson, which he did, that through his suffering, which was quite severe, luckily it only lasted a day or two, there was redemption. So I do think it's true. I do think it's a hard journey. I know for me, I couldn't accept it as a doctor, that there's value in human suffering. Now I have seen that there is value in human suffering, and part of my role as a doctor is to make sure you don't waste it.
Yeah, and I also think that in a certain way, if we don't find value in suffering, it's not clear that we find value in not suffering.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Right? Because, our value is really in our capacity to love.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think you're right.
Without that, I think that's what we see more and more, which is why people who want to end their lives when they're suffering often, well, I mean, then, what's really going to fulfill it? A little job, a little rent, a little, what will fulfill that? And I think it's also trapped in an illusion. And, if you could comment on this, especially maybe your experience as a doctor or whatever, and witnessing to suffering, is that it's also a profound illusion somehow that we have that we can escape suffering or outrun suffering, or that the doctors will take care of me so I won't have to feel pain or suffering. And instead of the idea is that, no, we're always already in suffering at some various level. Sometimes some people are in extreme suffering, absolutely. But it's because of the ubiquitous or always character of suffering that allows Christ then to enter into our suffering, so that our suffering is never alone. We have our best friend and God incarnate and our Savior, right, suffering with us.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the truth, is to learn how to share that suffering with Christ. It brings you closer to Christ. If you can embrace the suffering. And I'm not saying it's an easy journey. I do think it helps if you have support that helps you begin to see the value that suffering may have. That's why I try with my patients to have them, decide where they want to channel that value. What is it that you want to channel that value? Is it for a family member? Is it for some societal problem? Is it what would you like the redemptive value to be of your suffering? Very few people that I've met, when we get deep into this in this discussion, say, "Oh, I want it to be to solve me, to make me better." No, I haven't really encountered patients that say, "Oh, yeah, I want that to be channeled to cure me. I want to walk again, or I want to be healed." I do see that they channel it either to a societal problem, or to a family member that's struggling, or sometimes, just to channel it to pray for the people that have nobody to pray for them.
We have that capacity, or maybe we have a proclivity, an inclination to resist suffering and rebel against it, which is very understandable. And yet we also have the capacity to kind of see beyond suffering, maybe see through suffering to love, and maybe even to see through suffering to the love of the one who made us and redeemed us. And just as our work can somehow be offered to God, our suffering can be offered to God, and that in a way everything we do matters. So we're coming up at the time for a break, but I really appreciate your walking through how this journey of faith for you has helped you kind of lead others on this journey of faith and meaning. When we get back from our break, I want to ask a little bit about now kind of bringing it to a more recent, aspect of suffering. You were the 18th director of the CDC, appointed in 2018, when, lo and behold, right in 2020, we have an unprecedented, kind of pandemic and an unprecedented response to the pandemic in a global way. So I want to hear more about what you think we've learned, and maybe how your Catholic faith helped you, and also maybe what are some public health lessons that maybe we can learn now as we reflect 5 years later.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
I am happy to be speaking with actually Sir Dr. Robert Redfield, because you were knighted by John Paul II, correct?
Well, actually, Pope Francis,
Pope Francis.
approved it through the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, yeah.
That's great. So glad to have you on the show and to have you walk us through really the discovery of faith in the personal God and the God who encounters us in Jesus Christ, right? Saved us through his mission of his son. And also talking about this way that even like a doctor who spends his life somewhat trying to, often people would think, to help people not suffer. But in some ways, I suppose that's a little bit of a childish view, because a lot of it is accompanying people who do suffer and helping them to discover what you learned is that the miracle of accepting suffering is really the miracle in a way that Jesus opens up for us. Now, we're now, and this episode will be released in 2025, 5 years after, I guess the coronavirus or the COVID outbreak started, I think in the end of 2019, but 2020 is the year where kind of everything hit the fan, so to speak. So you were at the center of so much. What are some things, maybe looking back 5 years later, that are some lessons that you think we might learn either about diseases, about public health, about societies?
Yeah, well, the first one, and it's a hard lesson that I pray we learn, and I'm working in my own way to try to help it. I'm now a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation for Biosecurity and Public Health Policy. And one of the realities that many people, I don't think, have come to grip with is that biosecurity is probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, national security threat that our nation has.
And what's biosecurity for maybe listeners or viewers who may not be familiar with that?
So what I mean is the ability to protect ourselves against the threat of an infectious agent that could affect man and cause great harm. And you can look at COVID-19 as an example. I always call the COVID-19 epidemic as the lesser epidemic. So people get a little nervous when I say that, because I'm anticipating that we're going to have the great epidemic, which is going to be a bird flu epidemic, which you hear a lot about in the news. It hasn't learned how to really affect man that efficiently yet. But we can come back and talk more about it. It has great potential to cause a very significant epidemic in humanity. Now, me as a Catholic scientist, public health doctor, when I say something like that, I don't get freaked out. Because I always, when I was CDC director, I had a phrase that I used to share, and I actually got put on a little paperweight that I used to give to people that visited ministers of health. And the phrase that I said was, "With God, all things are possible." Now, when the federal government produced my paperweight, they said, "All things are possible." So they left the first part out. Okay. But I've always said, it's with God, all things are possible. And I carry with me all the time, because I occasionally see people that are struggling, and I carry a couple of these coins that I pass on to them when I see them struggling.
Let's say, with God, all things are possible, Mark 10:27.
That's it. So they understand that even though they think they're dying of an illness or whatever, I just try to remind them that with God, all things are possible. Yeah. So that's why I don't get freaked out, even though I am concerned that we're potentially on the verge of a serious pandemic with bird flu, and we can talk about that. But the COVID pandemic it should have been a wake-up call. It probably started in the summer of 2019. There were two hypotheses for the origin. One was spillover, that it came from bats into some animal and then got into humans. And the other was that it was actually engineered by scientists in a laboratory through what we call gain-of-function research. This is research that scientists intentionally try to teach a pathogen to be more pathogenic. Now, I'm of the view, and I don't have any doubt in my mind now, 5 years later, that the source of COVID was a laboratory, and it was a direct consequence of what I call scientific arrogance, where people didn't see the downside, and they intentionally changed COVID-19. They could not infect humans, and they taught it how to infect humans. And then, and I think they were doing that for good reason. They were trying to develop a vaccine vector that they could use to vaccinate large populations, but they never gave enough credence to the fact that that virus they were creating could escape. And as we now know, it's caused anywhere from 7 to 20 million people in the world have died as a consequence of those experiments. So my own view, one of the other lessons that we need to learn, which the scientific community has not learned, is that we shouldn't be doing this gain-of-function research. We shouldn't be trying to teach pathogens how to be very pathogenic for man. Tony Fauci, who's a colleague of mine in 2012, and Collins wrote a thing in the Washington Post really supporting gain-of-function research and thinking it was the key to the future, and even said in the op-ed that they wrote in the Post that if a great pandemic becomes because of this, it's worth the risk. Well, they supported this research. The U.S. helped fund this research. It's not just a Chinese lab. It was a U.S.-funded experiments that were doing in the Chinese lab. And in fact, ended up creating a virus. It's interesting, SARS, which is a virus that went from a bat to a civet cat to humans, when it got into humans, it really never learned how to efficiently go human to human. So as you and I sit here now, 25 years later, our SARS came in 2002, so 23 years later, so SARS has only infected less than 10,000 people in the world. So it never learned how to go human to human. And MERS, which came in 2012, 2013, another coronavirus, it went from a bat to a camel, and then from a camel into people. It also is less than 10,000 cases, 12, 13 years later. So, but when COVID came in, it immediately was infecting hundreds of thousands of people. And myself, as a clinical virologist, what that really meant is it had to be taught how to infect humans. And it turns out the lab involved in China actually published a paper in 2014 where they published that they had successfully learned how to teach coronaviruses how to infect human tissue. So they did the experiments, and this was a creation. And it's very disappointing to me that the scientific community hasn't been honest about this, and partially because they're trying to protect gain-of-function research, and partially because they don't want science regulated. But I'm hopeful that we'll have a moratorium on it until we can learn how to do it in a safe, responsible, and effective way if society decides we actually need this research in the first place. So that's one thing. We learned a lot of other things, I think, sadly, that hurt public health is you need to tell the American public the truth. You don't need to force your truth on them. You need to tell them the truth. So, for example, the decision that was made by certain people that everybody should be vaccinated, and then they passed all these mandates to vaccinate everybody. But it turns out that the COVID vaccine, which I helped develop on Warp Speed, I'm very proud of it. We saved a lot of lives for the vulnerable. Mm-hmm. If you were vulnerable over 65, this vaccine could have saved your life. But this vaccine has no value in a 30-year-old, and it just has a downside. It doesn't have an upside. So my CDC that several months ago just recommended all children over the age of 1 month to get the COVID vaccine doesn't make any sense at all because the COVID vaccine does not prevent infection. What it prevents is serious illness, hospitalization, and death. But kids don't get seriously ill from COVID. So there was a lot of, I think, lack of truthfulness in the public health science community because certain people believed as if they had an opinion, just like they had an opinion that the virus came from spillover, but there was no data to support that opinion. I had the hypothesis that came from the lab, and I can show you lots of data to support that. There are other people that had an opinion that everyone should be vaccinated, whether they wanted to or not. So we'll just mandate the vaccine. If you want to fly on an airplane, you got to be vaccinated. If you want to come in the United States, you got to be vaccinated. If you're in the military, you got to be vaccinated. If you want to work in a hospital, you got to be vaccinated. Why? Particularly if there's no data that the vaccine stops transmission, stops acquisition. So again, there was a lack of, I think, honest transparency by the public health community with the public, which is unfortunately going to take years to rebuild that loss of trust. I think, the other thing that I fought against unsuccessfully in general, although Arkansas, North Dakota, a couple places, Archdiocese of Baltimore, listened to me, I strongly recommended against closing schools. I felt that the K through 12 public health was better served by these kids being in face-to-face learning than it was by them going virtual. And unfortunately, fast forward 5 years, I've been proven to be right. The same thing I could argue is we shouldn't have shut down our economy. I agree with Mike Pence, who is the vice president. Mike and I believe that we should take a knee, like in a football game, for maybe 15 to 30 days and try to figure out how we modify certain activities to make them safer. But we should have never shut them down. Big mistake. But it was driven by certain people that felt they knew better than you did about what was right for you. So, as I worry about the bird flu pandemic, which is coming, I think we should be very careful about taking away personal autonomy. We can be more personal about our faith in the church. And I gave a talk in August of 21. I was invited to the Vatican to give a talk. And similar to the talk I'm going to give tonight, same title, Science, Medicine, Pandemics, and the Catholic Faith. And, the cardinals were there, and it was in the Vatican. The Pope wasn't actually at my talk, but the people around him were there, and it was in the Vatican, and I met with the Pope afterwards. The Catholic Church had no business shutting down the sacraments. My grandchildren don't believe our Lord's in the Blessed Sacrament, because if our Lord was in the Blessed Sacrament, the Church wouldn't have stopped giving it out. We stopped visiting the sick. Many people died alone in the hospital without the sacraments. When I gave my talk, and I'll talk about it tonight a little for a second, I reminded people how the Catholic Church provided leadership in the 1300s when the plague epidemic came. And what did they do? They went out and took care of the sick. And what did they do is they increased the sacraments. And what did they do? Roger Bacon and others started the scientific method to try to figure out what the heck was going on. What did we do when the COVID pandemic? I live right next to the Cathedral, Mary Queen. They stopped saying no mass. No mass for people. No communion. No sacraments. What had happened to the priest in the hospital? Oh, they couldn't go visit the patients. This was a big mistake. And I said one of the reasons I pushed it so hard in my speech in the Vatican was not to be critical, but to make sure they don't make the same mistake next time. Because there is going to be a next time. And the church has got to rise above it. And, tell me in my cathedral that seats hundreds and hundreds of people that they only can have like 30 people in the church. Give me a break. As CDC director, I fought this. I got a lot of criticism. I told my CDC colleagues we have no business telling worshipers, whether they're Muslims or Jewish or Christian or Catholic, how to worship. That's not our role as a public health. We can tell them the facts about how this virus is transmitted, how to wash their hands, but let's not get into the nuance and say you can no longer have Eucharist. You can't do that. No, bye-bye. So big mistake. Those were all mistakes that were made. But I think, fundamentally the most important one was a lack of transparency, a lack of truthfulness. I remember a colleague of mine who's very famous was talking about herd immunity a lot. And I'm telling the president that when we got 30% of people vaccinated and infected, we'd have herd immunity, which meant the pandemic would die out. And I said, I'm a clinical virologist. I said, I don't think there's any herd immunity for coronaviruses. And so when we got to 30%, the pandemic was continuing, and he said 50%. And so, okay. And some people wanted to believe that because, they wanted the pandemic to be over, right? And a little later, he said 70%. And a very astute reporter said to him, Dr. So-and-so, can you tell me the new data that you have now that made you change your opinion from several months ago when you said 50%, now you say 70%? And you know what he said? He said, there is no new data. When I told you 50%, I told you that because I didn't think you were ready to hear 70%. In other words, people packaged their statements to what they thought the public wanted to hear rather than just, I told this person afterwards, because we did a lot of education in the American public. He was a prominent spokesperson. I said, just tell them the truth. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know the answer. That was one of my most common answers, actually. Yeah. My CDC got mad at me when I would say, I don't know the answer, So you don't know, tell the truth. So that's one of the big lessons, is to be honest and transparent with the American public. Obviously, I think mandates don't work. When we mandated vaccines, all we did is get people that were hesitant to vaccines, and we solidified their hesitancy. So you may have some other particular questions you can ask me, but
those are really helpful. And I also just, thinking about our conversation that we just had, if there is no meaningful value in suffering, then the job is just to prevent all suffering, to prevent every death. And we live in this illusional world that somehow, that we're just going to tell whatever, we're going to kind of manipulate situations however we can in order because we just think death is the worst thing. Instead of recognizing that human beings are multifaceted, children also love to learn. Yeah. And so not letting them learn for a few years is actually really devastating to their development. Not letting old people die with company or young people die with company, but just the whole idea of or leaving churches open. I mean, you can visit Walmart, you can visit Jesus, but we couldn't legally in a lot of states.
Big box stores were open.
Yeah. And Planned Parenthood, my understanding.
But the churches, there's no doubt, big mistakes, big ears, big brother, big mistake.
Yeah.
When you look back at COVID, I'm concerned because a lot of people don't appreciate. We lost 1.2 million people died in the first 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
We had the most successful vaccine development program in the history of the world. So, we're at really risk for, a significant pandemic, and we need to get better prepared for the pandemic. I do think the bird flu pandemic has a reasonable chance of crossing over from the mammals and the birds that it's currently into man. And, if bird flu learns how to go man to man, then we're going to have big problems. Colleagues in 2012 discovered the 4 amino acids that you have to change in bird flu to make it highly efficient in infecting man. And I argued back then that we shouldn't publish that. I didn't think it was in our interest to put that out there for nutcases that want to cause chaos. Tony Fauci, who was the big advocate of gain-of-function research, and I was sort of the big advocate for a moratorium on gain-of-function research, advocated that it was science and it had to be published. And sadly, it was published. I consider it sort of a miracle that no one's used that yet to cause, bioterrorism attacks, etc. But we know it's only 4 amino acids, and the bird flu virus now is in over 150 million turkeys and chickens in the United States since 2019. And it's crossed over now into 48 mammal species, including dolphins and seals and bobcats and bears and cats, and most recently dairy cows, and most recently pigs. Now, in mammals, it still hasn't learned how to go mammal to mammal, except for one exception in Argentina, where a group of seals the virus evolved so it could go seal to seal. But it has been so far pretty restricted to bird. But it is changing those amino acids. And even in the humans infected, we've had 68 humans infected. One recently died in Louisiana. That virus in Louisiana was a different virus. We call it bird flu D1.1. So that's a new virus of bird flu, and that does seem to be more pathogenic for humans. And even with that human that got it, when the CDC followed that virus time infection to death, it changed more, and during the time, it actually learned how to replicate better in that Louisiana gentleman. So this virus is, pushing to learn how to go man to man. And if it does, it's going to be a problem, because we've had, probably less than 800 cases of bird flu in the last 20 years, mostly in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, largely from bird workers that got infected, and it didn't go human to human, so it was the end. But when you look at it, about 40% of those people died. So this is not like COVID. Bird flu is going to have a 5 to 50% mortality. It's going to be problematic.
Yeah. We are coming to the end of our show, and so I do want to move to our final section, but just maybe, in a minute or two, if you could, just the average listener who might be a little concerned. Obviously, they're not in charge of the CDC. They don't have to make those decisions. But is there anything you think that people in their day-to-day life can do to kind of prepare, in addition, obviously, to pray and to just, develop that relationship with God that's going to go, be much longer and much more beautiful than our suffering?
As I said, I agree with God. All things are possible. I have great confidence in the power of science, reminding people that science is a gift from God.
Mm-hmm.
All right, it's not over here as a secular thing by itself. We talked yesterday about faith and reason being, two wings on the same, to try to, pursue truth, as Pope John Paul would say. So, obviously what I've tried to become is an advocate of supporting our government to get more seriously prepared. Not just dismiss it, that this is nothing we worry about it. When I think about how we get prepared for our traditional national security threats, we have an Army, a Navy, an Air Force, and Marines. We have bases all over the world. We're prepared for China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. Well, we need to get similarly prepared for these, what I call biosecurity. And I have a plan that I think we should pursue. So I just hope people get more proactive about getting prepared. It doesn't help to get overly fixated, but to prepare it and try to, reinforce the need to rebuild trust in science and trust in public health, which is going to be a heavy lift because, the COVID pandemic really, I think, its biggest negative aspect on our nation was not the 1.2 million people that died, which is a huge loss of life. And the other thing I like to say, people think COVID's over. COVID is still one of the major causes of death. We're losing around, 100 to 150 people a day in our country die of COVID. Just think of that. That's a lot. That's about, every 3 days we're losing a 747. All right. People think it's over. It's not over. And most of the people that are dying are otherwise relatively healthy people like me. We're just over 65 and we have a little diabetes or a little hypertension, even though it may be well controlled. So I think, having confidence in supporting the need to continue to invest in science.
That's great.
And pushing hard for our government to be more proactive in getting prepared for this pandemic, I think would be very helpful for the American public. and then basically reminding our public health leaders as this happens not to make the same mistakes they made last time, because they sure made a lot.
That's great. So we are kind of coming up at the end of our time. 3 questions I like to ask all my guests. Do you have what's a book you're reading?
What book am I reading? Well, that's a good question. I was going to say it's, because I reread it all the time, was probably The Principle and Practice of Medicine by Harrison, just to keep myself up to date on the changes in medicine. Because let me tell you, it changes a lot.
That's wonderful.
So I will say, unfortunately, most of my reading continues to be related to my profession. It's not easy keeping up. It changes a lot.
Yeah. Well, that's a great duty too. If you're in a profession, it's good to be committed to continue to learn. And so secondly, what's a spiritual practice you do on a regular basis to find meaning and purpose in your life and grow closer to God?
Well, I think, spending time in conversation. Now that I know God's a person, we can have a conversation. I don't, for many years I was a daily communicative, and then now, in the last couple of years, it's not every day, but I do love going to Mass and the Blessed Sacrament, very special. Obviously, a close relationship with the Blessed Mother and a devotion for the Rosary. But I do think prayer is a really important part of life to reflect on it. My wife is great because every morning she sends all of my children and grandchildren and me the daily reading and the saint of the day,
Yes,
and the life of the saint of the day, to make sure that we stay focused on trying to learn something from these wonderful people that have come before us.
I remember reading in an article, I don't know if it's true or not, but I was preparing for this podcast, reading about you. Somebody said that you compared adoration to radiation
Oh, absolutely.
treatment.
Radiation therapy. Unbelievable. There's no doubt about it. It's true that, sitting before the Blessed Sacrament in adoration of the Blessed Sacrament it's radiation therapy for the whole body and soul. There's no doubt about it. I can actually feel it. I can palpate it. My wife and I help invest in an adoration chapel in our church. It's a very, I know you have an adoration chapel here. It's a very special thing to take time to be in the presence of our Lord and in the adoration. And I will tell you, I can't measure it as a scientist, but I physically can feel it.
That's beautiful. And the last question, what's a belief you held about God, and what was that you learned was false, and what was the truth you discovered?
Well, I think we talked about that at the beginning.
Yeah.
I was convinced by many of my Georgetown professors that God was an energy force. In that I'm not related to James Redfield, the Philistine prophecy, but in other words, that was the principle. It's an energy force, and I remember when the Haiti earthquake happened. It was, I think, in 2010. I was in Switzerland at the time. I had a treatment program going on in Haiti and Port-au-Prince and all through the country, actually, for AIDS. And so I had teams there, and the hospital that I had in Port-au-Prince had collapsed, and really everybody in it died, was buried alive for a number of days. It was very frustrating. I took a plane to home, saw my wife. She had a bag packed for me, and little duffel bag. I didn't really know what was in it. And then I went off to Santo Domingo and then hoofed it into Port-au-Prince to be there, to be part of the emergency response. In my hospital, Shock Trauma Maryland, supported me by ultimately we sent surgical teams down there. We worked for over 6 months trying to save people's lives. It was a very special experience. Now, my colleagues that came down with me to save lives, the surgeons, let's say they were relatively secular. And so, they were really convinced that, God was either vengeful, and that's why the earthquake. And that earthquake, more people died in that earthquake than ever died in the history of man since the Great Flood. Okay, over 300,000 people died ultimately. And or there wasn't a God.
Yeah.
And when I told, of course, my friends that there was a God, and God was merciful, and you had to trust in God. And when I opened up my duffel bag to see what I had, hoping I had peanut butter and tuna fish and stuff to eat while I was down there, because it was really a mess. My wife had my entire bag full of rosaries that she wanted me to give out to the people that we were taking care of, which I did take care of a number of the people. And I remember when I was there, it was tough, okay? The papal nuncio came and offered to, he asked me if I needed something. I said, yeah, I need Mother Teresa's sisters to help me out because we worked with them. I want them to open a home so I can move my paraplegics to the home so they can die with dignity without flies all over them, because we had no sanitation and it was a mess. And so they scheduled the sisters to come see me to do that, but then they canceled. It was on a Tuesday, and I remember I was really quite disappointed. And then on Saturday, I heard a bunch of noise at the gate, and we had a hospital that was really just on the ground that we had just laying people and tried to take care of them the best we could. And there was some people came in orange and yellow suits, and they had a big truck, and they were speaking, looking for Professor Redfield. And I went up and met them, and I said, who are you? And he said, well, the Pope sent us. I said, what do you mean the Pope sent us? Well, we have our plane down at the airfield, and we're sent here to take your paraplegics back to Rome to take care of them. And they each can have one family member go with them. Do you believe that? Unbelievable. Wow. And I got all my paraplegics, got onto the truck and onto the plane and back to Rome, and they all didn't die. I saw one of them many years later. She was a young woman, a beautiful woman, and she came back to Haiti. She was alive. So it was a very spiritual experience but for my colleagues, I remember asking God to do me a favor one day. It was the feast of the saint who the hospital was named after. I said, God, will you do me a favor and just let these paraplegics get up and walk? I want to show these doctors that there's, you really do have some power here. So it was a great experience going through that earthquake, which I did. But it taught me a lot about God, and taught me to help teach other people not to misinterpret the events that happen in life as they did. They assumed it meant there was no God. They assumed that there was only a vengeful God, and I was trying to argue that there's a merciful God. And yet sometimes we don't see it.
That's very beautifully put, and that's a great story. And it reminds me, we had somebody on the podcast, Immaculée Lebegiza, who is the survivor of the Rwandan genocide, and she eventually ended up even forgiving the neighbors, basically the villagers who had killed her family. And she, but I remember one time she just said, "Life is short, eternity is long. Life is short, eternity is long." And God's mercy is that He is present with us now, that our suffering now joins us to Him. But Christ didn't come merely to suffer. Christ came to rise again and to defeat death and suffering. And so our hope is in, the risen Lord. And I think that's the only way. And I just think you can't ultimately kind of square the circle of life and suffering here below without a deep hope that, and I like to sometimes, for me, I remember life is not only, life is short, eternity is long, and eternity is happy. So
it would be nice, though,
yeah,
if our Lord would grant us a great favor and suck evil out of this world.
Amen. Amen. I think He will soon.
Yeah,
He will very soon. And we all will eventually be well in the new heavens and the new earth. Every tear will be wiped away, right? And there'll be no more suffering and death in Revelation 21:4. Well, Sir Dr. Redfield, we are so blessed to have you here. So thank you for your just sharing your faith so abundantly through your practice, but also as a teacher, and for helping us to, see what we also should be hoping to do if we end up in another pandemic. But if nothing else, our hope is in the Lord. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Just remember, keep the sacraments rolling.
I agree 200%.
All right, God bless.
Thank you. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.